Dobrze, proszę Państwa, to ja może zacznę. Słowo wstępu. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everyone at the seminar organized by the Richarda Pipesa Laboratorium, which operates in the Institute of Political Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences. My name is Wojciech Wysek and I'm the secretary on this project. I'm glad you to seminar about the book, Collective Memory in Post-Soviet Kaliningrad Oblast. Hence, it is a pleasure to welcome the author of the book, Miłosz Cordes. The discussion will be led by Iwona Reichert from periodical New Eastern Europe. I wish all participants an interesting discussion. I would like to give the floor to Iwona Reichert. Thank you.
Thank you, Wojciech. Hello, everybody. Very nice to see you, and I'm happy we have such an audience at this time of the day and this time of the year. Let me welcome our participants, our panelists. As you have heard from Wojciech, the main protagonist, the main hero of today is Miłosz Cordes, who is the author of the book that we'll be discussing. Miłosz is an assistant professor at the Danish Institute for Study Abroad in Copenhagen, but he's also a research fellow at the Danish Foreign Policy Society. And he's most importantly for us, Miłosz's academic research interests include the Kaliningrad Oblast, memory, and especially with the focus on memory. He's author of the current book, Collective Memory in the Post-Soviet Kaliningrad Oblast, but also of the report that was published in 2024 by the Danish Institute of International Affairs, entitled Kaliningrad Oblast 2024, Russia's Vessel of Havoc on the Baltic Sea. But in our discussion, we'll mostly focus on the current book. And also equally importantly, from 2011 till 2012 till 2021, Miłosz worked for the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, and from 2018 till 2021, he was the Vice Consul of the Polish Republic in Kaliningrad. Currently, he is an academic and a researcher. My other panelist is Krzysztof Rzęgota, who is the associate professor at the University of Warmia and Mazury in Olsztyn. And his academic research also include Kaliningrad Oblast, but also security issues with a special focus on Central and Eastern Europe. And he's also author of a book on Kaliningrad. The title of his book, which was published in Polish, is Obwód Kaliningradzki Federacji Rosyjskiej a bezpieczeństwo międzynarodowe Europy Środkowo-Wschodniej między geopolityką a konstruktywizmem. In English, this title reads as follows: The Kaliningrad of the Russian Federation and the International Security of Central and Eastern Europe, Between Geopolitics and Constructivism. Thank you both for participating in this discussion, and maybe I will share with everybody the plan, the initial plan. We would like to first give the floor to Miłosz to present his book, the main findings, and then I would like to ask Krzysztof to comment on Miłosz's presentation, and then I would like to open the floor to all of us, and feel free to start asking questions. To do so, please either raise your hand or mark in the chat that you would like to ask a question. Thank you. Miłosz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Iwona, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for having me here, for organizing this discussion. I'm particularly grateful to the Richarda Pipesa Laboratory of the Polish Academy of Sciences. It's a privilege to be here. It's a big joy for me to be here, because as we were talking just before we started this event, Kaliningrad Oblast is not an area that is of particular interest academic-wise, but also media-wise. There are some exceptions, and the New Eastern Europe bi-monthly is definitely among those, and I have always been very, very grateful to the New Eastern Europe for keeping this topic afloat. There's a number of authors who have published about Kaliningrad Oblast. me myself included, in New Eastern Europe, and that's definitely something that's worth pointing out. And then among these scholars that have been dealing with Kaliningrad Oblast is definitely Professor Krzysztof Rzęgota, and again one of the very positive exceptions to that general not very positive rule. The book was published 2 weeks ago, and now I would like to focus on a few elements in this book. In my presentation, I'll share my screen with you, and there's a number of slides, and I can really tell you that if you want to get this presentation afterwards, I'm more than happy to share it with you. This is the cover of the book, but this is also the lead photo that I took in Kaliningrad when I was there in my capacity as Poland's vice consul. And that's another thing. I was dealing with Kaliningrad Oblast and identity issues in Kaliningrad Oblast already as an academic while I was doing my PhD studies between 2015 and 2017, and I was at the Institute of Slavic Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences. But then I also had the privilege to come back to Kaliningrad after the research, to come back there in a different capacity, the capacity of a Polish consular employee or Polish diplomat, where I spent 3 years in Kaliningrad as vice consul of Poland's Consul General in Kaliningrad Oblast. One thing that I can already mention right now is that when I look back at my research, which commenced 10 years ago, and then the not so distant times of my diplomatic service in Kaliningrad, I can already tell that these were different times. For one obvious reason, we're talking about ongoing war, full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, which has greatly influenced the situation on the ground in Kaliningrad Oblast. But at the same time, I'm talking about some other changes that were initiated already in early to mid 2010s. And this is what this book is also hinting at or talks about, and I will try to delve into it in my presentation. I am talking in my book about the confrontation of memories. This is a concept that was first introduced by Professor Karolina Ćwiek-Rogalska from the Institute of Slavic Studies, the Polish Academy of Sciences. But Karolina talks about the competition of memories when she refers to those areas in today's Czechia and today's Poland that at some point belonged to Germany or consisted of a sizable German-speaking minority, and she focuses on this transition period after the Second World War, where certain elements, certain narratives related to memory belonging to one ethnic group or political group for that reason too, were being replaced due to the changed geopolitical circumstances by another element. In the context of Kaliningrad Oblast, I feel, and this is what stems from my research, that we should rather be talking about something a bit more intense and a bit more even aggressive, I would say, in a way, and that's confrontation of memories. And the memories that I have in mind are specifically related to the pre-war past of Kaliningrad Oblast. So the area that used to belong to a greater political entity, and I'm talking about East Prussia, but also about the Wilhelmine Germany, the Weimar Republic, and the Third Reich. And I'll start from this because I feel it will help us understand the situation on the ground in Kaliningrad, and today's Kaliningrad, better. Now, this is the map of Kaliningrad Oblast. As you see, the border between Kaliningrad Oblast and Poland to the south looks strangely straight. And that also tells us that it resembles borders that we might have all seen, for instance, in the United States, or in Africa, in between different states in the US or nation states in Africa, and in this, in a way, a neo-colonial or post-colonial border. That's because the north of East Prussia is what is now Kaliningrad Oblast, whereas the south was added to Poland after the Second World War, and I think that this border really, really reflected that this border, this division, is very much superficial. Speaking about East Prussia, what you see on this picture is the main square in Kaliningrad, is the Victory Square, so Plošť Pobjedy. And I feel that this picture really shows us, in a nutshell, how different narratives on memory and different narratives on the pre-war but also post-war past are still present in Kaliningrad. What you see in front of this picture is a column. It's an obelisk, and that's the victory column, which was instituted there after the war and was obviously about the victory in the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians call it, and how Soviets called it. But then you also see elements of one of the biggest Eastern Orthodox churches in the whole of Russia. This is actually where this picture was taken from. But you also have the bell tower to the left. Then the whole square, now it's called Victory Square. Before 1933, it was called Hanseplatz, so Hanseatic Square. And then between 1933 and 1945, it was called Adolf Hitler Platz, which in itself is a very good summary of all the changes that this area underwent since 1918 up until 1945. Some of the buildings you see are very much from that period. Some of them are from the Soviet period, and some of them from the modern period. And you could also spot, if you enlarge this picture, you'll also spot some other elements related to collective memory, some monuments, or some things looming on the horizon that I'll be talking about in my presentation. Well, this is East Prussia as it was part of the Wilhelmine Germany, so the Germany that was unified by the Hohenzollern dynasty as a result of the victorious war against France in 1870. Then in Versailles, the unified Second Reich was brought to life in 1871. And then, as a result of the First World War, this territory was divided or separated from mainland Germany by the Polish-Pomeranian voivodeship and the Free City of Gdańsk or Danzig. Because of that, parts of the former province of West Prussia, or German West Prussia, were added to East Prussia, and this is why the area looks slightly different. Then to the north is also the territory of Memel, of Klaipeda, that up until 1939 was either a free city or belonged to Lithuania. So I think that this map and it tells us two things. One thing that is that East Prussia occupied a very peripheral location in pre-1914 or 1920 Germany, and this peripheral location was very much reflected not only in political terms but also in economic terms. It was rather lagging behind in terms of economic development compared to the rest of Germany, and a lot of people in other parts of Germany did not know much about East Prussia, and I think it was depicted really well by Robert Budzinski. He was an artist who drew a lot of very ominously and mysteriously looking locations in East Prussia, sort of underlining this aura of mysteriousness related to East Prussia, and he published most of these drawings actually after the war in a book called Entdeckung Ostpreußens, so the discovery of East Prussia. Another element is that East Prussia, despite its peripheral geographical, political, and economic location and role in pre-war Germany, actually had a very, very important role for the formation of the German national identity, also in political terms. not only the German nation understood as one language and one culture, so Kulturnation and Einzelsprache, but also as a political entity. And Bismarck and other decision makers in Berlin definitely needed East Prussia for this reason. There's a number of books that talk about this phenomenon. I just picked two, which I feel depicted really well from both the German perspective, but also from someone who is a native Polish speaker's perspective. One is Andreas Korsed, Ostpreußen Geschichte und Mythos. And this book was issued in a different way, in different forms across the last 15 years. And then there's also the East Prussianist book, so Wschodniopruskość by Robert Traba, where Professor Traba talks about different myths that were created around East Prussia and the role for the political culture in pre-1945 or pre-1918 Germany, as well as the role for the German national identity. And I'll just talk about a few elements. But before I do that, I wanted to maybe highlight somehow that East Prussia as a territory where different people lived was a very much multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic territory. And these are just examples of territories or like sub-territories within East Prussia and West Prussia for that matter, and different ethnicities and different people of different religions that were inhabiting those areas. And they all matter not only from the German point of view, but there were also Dutch settlers of different Protestant denominations. There was also a sizable population that spoke a dialect of the Polish language, so Mazury. But what distinguished them from the neighbors from the nearby Mazovia area was that they were largely Protestants. But we also had Swiss and Austrian refugees. They came there in the beginning of the 18th century. There's also the big role of East Prussia in the development of the contemporary or modern time Lithuanian national identity. The whole eastern part of today's Kaliningrad Oblast is the so-called Mažoji Lietuva, so Lithuania Minor, where a lot of Lithuanians lived and continue to live actually to this very day, although in smaller numbers. And East Prussia was that territory where printing of Lithuanian language book in Latin alphabet was still possible in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. So definitely contributed to sustaining and then developing the feeling of Lithuanian national identity. There are also some signs or some remnants, some residues of the pagan Prussians or Pruthenians or Baltic tribe, or different tribes actually constitute what we understand under the name of Prussians these days. And there were some places in pre-war East Prussia that actually kept the memory of those people who were largely assimilated after the Teutonic Knight conquest, but some of them continued to live as a separate entity in some separated areas within East Prussia, and one of those names is, for instance, Sudarische Winkel. Another thing, I mean, Königsberg, and I will be talking about Königsberg, Kaliningrad a lot in my presentation, as I do in my book. It was important not only for Lithuanians, but also at some point was the second largest Polish language printing center in early modern times, right after Krakow. I think it's a good year to publish this book for this reason, because it's the 500th anniversary of the Prussian homage. So I'm also very happy that Ivona is joining us from Krakow to talk about this book. But again, when we talk about Wilhelmine Germany, so the roughly 55, almost 60 years of existence of East Prussia within the Second German Reich, it played a role precisely because of the Teutonic Order's conquest of pagan or Baltic Prussians. This phenomenon that happening in history was very much used by decision makers in Berlin to create a distinctive feeling of German national identity. The Teutonic Knights were presented as the German outpost in the east, but the light of civilization, of organized expansion, of the rule of law, of Germanic strength, as opposed to the sea of Slavic disorder, of lack of strong political institutions. And all of this was very much focused, at some point became focused after the German defeat in the First World War. East Prussia was the only territory of Germany that was partly occupied by Germany's opponents. There was an East Prussian offensive launched by the Russian troops to somehow help the French and the British troops fighting on the Western Front. And it led to a temporary occupation of approximately half of East Prussia. The biggest battle that took place during that time, a few months in the latter part of 1914, was the battle. It was called in German historiography the Battle of Tannenberg, and that was not a coincidence, because that was supposed to be the German response to the defeat that the Teutonic Knights suffered from joint Polish, Lithuanian, and Ruthenian forces in 1410 under the Battle of Tannenberg, or in Polish historiography it's referred to as the Battle of Grunwald. So that was supposed to be a response, that was supposed to be a revenge, and to commemorate that event, and also just to increase the importance of East Prussia in the German national mythology, a huge monumental memorial complex was built on the battle site. So outside of today's town of Olsztynek or Hohenstein, there was this memorial place built to commemorate the victory of Tannenberg, and it became even more prominent after the last president of the Weimar Republic, Paul von Hindenburg, who was actually a commander in 1914 in that battle, died and was buried on that site. It was very much used by the Nazis to strengthen that myth of the importance of East Prussia in the German national mythology. But then in 1945, when the whole area was conquered by the Red Army, these myths were not necessarily, they did not sink into oblivion. They continued to live in a different way. Already in 1944, they were somehow reversed by the Soviet war propaganda, as East Prussia was referred to as the lair of the fascist beast, as the site of the Dog Knights. This is how the Teutonic Knights were referred to, as that ominous island of Germanness, the ominous island of fascism and Nazism that was looming over the peaceful Slavic nations. And I think it was very much reflected in what happened in 1944 and 1945. That was the first province of Germany within its 1937 borders, which the Red Army entered. And for this reason, Red Army soldiers were encouraged to pillage, to destroy, to rape, because that was supposed to be a vendetta taking on the Germans for everything that happened in other parts of the Soviet Union and all the atrocities committed by Wehrmacht and the Nazi officials. So this actually sealed the fate of East Prussia. The scale of destruction was large because of that, even though very often it didn't really make much sense to destroy some of the material sites, as there was no opposition over there. The only exception being Königsberg. Even though the Soviet troops were already advancing and getting closer to Berlin, Königsberg was still defending, and as a result of a siege that lasted for 2.5 months, the city was almost completely destroyed in April 1945. Although one needs to remember that the historical city center was destroyed already in August 1945 by 2 British air raids. And they were there to break down the civilian resistance spirit among Germans, because Königsberg was the largest and easternmost German city. So if the British aviation was able to reach it, that meant that any resistance is futile. well, we know that it was not necessarily the case, and well, the city actually suffered from it, which is a bit paradoxical because Königsberg itself was not a particularly pro-Nazi city. It had very, not even conservative city, it had very left-leaning tendencies. A lot of prominent social democratic politicians in Germany came from that area. And Hitler himself didn't necessarily like East Prussia. He also didn't like Königsberg in particular. He preferred the south of Germany, and yet he was using East Prussia for propaganda purposes. Even though the city was destroyed, some sites survived, some didn't survive, obviously. But I think that the fate of different areas within Königsberg is something that helps us understand the changing attitude of the new settlers towards that East Prussian pre-war German, but not necessarily only German legacy. The fate of the royal castle, for instance, you can see it on the top right photo. The castle was actually damaged, but it was not fully destroyed, and it continued to function as ruins up until late 60s. And even though in the beginning was presented as this ominous memento of the Nazi times, also the Teutonic Knights, and everything that the Soviet leadership understood as that hostile, aggressive Germanness, already in the beginning of the 60s, it was a very popular site for walks for Kaliningraders, which suggests that a growing number of people was internalizing that pre-war legacy. They did not refer to it as, again, dangerous, ominous, reminding them of bad times. That's also related to the fact that in the 60s, the young generation did not remember the war or wasn't even born when the war took place. They were already born or they moved to Kaliningrad Oblast as small children. So for them, that was their surroundings. And for this reason, they really liked the castle. Despite this fact, the regional Communist Party leadership decided to destroy the ruins, and they were destroyed in the end of the 60s. But other sites did not meet the same fate. What you see on the picture to the left, that's Luisenkirche. Queen Louise was a very popular figure in the beginning of the 19th century. She was believed to convince Napoleon that Prussia, as not only as a province but also as a kingdom of Prussia, should not be completely destroyed. She also tried to sustain the civilian spirit of resistance against Napoleon, and she was commemorated with this neo-Romance church. The church survived the war, and it was only spared because it was converted into a puppet theater. And this happened not only spontaneously because of some activists just taking over this church, but it happened with the consent of the Communist Party functionaries in mid-70s. So that period between destroying the castle and saving this church is also something that marks the slow transition, the different approach to the pre-war legacy. Now, on the side of the royal castle, there's actually pretty much nothing. What you see, this big and not very pretty construction on the pictures below. This is a house of Soviets, and its construction began already in the 70s, continued throughout the 80s, but it was never finished. The building itself was too heavy to stand on the site, even though the ground was stabilized by some pillars, wooden pillars that were put into the ground. Over 1,100 of them were actually hammered into the ground, and yet it did not help to stabilize the ground. So it was never used. There were some ideas how to transform it, also because the authorities, both in the Soviet Union and then in the Russian Federation, wanted to make the House of the Soviet the landmark of Kaliningrad and Kaliningrad Oblast, but it was actually, as a result of all these architectural engineering mistakes, it was destroyed, it was torn into the ground a year ago, 2 years ago. The demolition started 2 years ago. So there's nothing on the side, and what you see on the foreground on the picture to the left are actually the remains of the royal castle that are still very much visible. Apart from that, there's nothing there. But you will see also on this picture, on the horizon, there's a number of blocks of flats. Most of them are actually traditional Brezhnevki, so 7 or 9 story buildings that were built in the historical center of Kaliningrad. But there's also a cathedral. The cathedral is somehow hidden behind the trees, and it was spared mostly because of Immanuel Kant, who was probably one of the most, if not the most prominent inhabitant of Königsberg, and because of his influence of Marx. So the tombstone of Immanuel Kant, who died in 1804, is adjacent to the cathedral. The cathedral was damaged during the British air raids, but it was never destroyed, and in this semi-ruined state and continued to exist up until the 90s, and then it was renovated with the help of German money, and this is why it survived the war, which is a very harrowing view, because if you look at the whole area, the Kneiphof island, it used to be one of the most densely populated and completely covered with buildings area of pre-war Königsberg, and now there's nothing there apart from the cathedral. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Kaliningrad found itself in a very, very dire situation. That's because throughout all the Soviet period, it was treated mostly as a military base. It was meant to host the Soviet Baltic Sea Navy. I mean, not Kaliningrad itself, but the city of Baltijsk. And by the way, this is something that will probably matter in the latter part of my presentation. Initially, Königsberg was meant to be renamed to Baltijsk. So just like a Baltic city, doesn't really have much ideological meaning. But in 1946, just before this change was supposed to take place, the formal head of the Soviet state, Mikhail Kalinin, died. The same one that's responsible for signing death sentences on those who suffered from Stalin's Great Purges, or for instance the Katyn massacre of Polish officers. This is why he's such a controversial figure in today's Poland, but not only in today's Poland. So he was decided to become the patron of the city, and this is how the city in mid-1946 was renamed to Kaliningrad, and the town of Pilau became Baltijsk, and it also became the main naval base of the Soviet Baltic fleet. Now, because of that, Kaliningrad was effectively cut out from the rest of the Soviet Union. You needed a special permit to get there. Although I know of some cases already during the Soviet period where even foreigners were able to semi-clandestinely travel to Kaliningrad and nothing happens to them. One of them was a former Polish diplomat. He told me the story, and he said he was very afraid of doing it, but he managed to do it. He traveled from Soviet Vilnius to Soviet Kaliningrad, and yeah, he managed. But in 1991, the area was in a very bad economic situation. It was always very much dependent on the help from the federal center, because of the scale of problems that Russia experienced throughout the 90s. So in Russian, usually this period is referred to as lichie 90s, so like bad 90s, sad 90s, tumultuous 90s. Kaliningrad definitely suffered more than the rest of the country, and it's actually envisaged in economic indicators. The gross regional product of Kaliningrad declined more than the gross domestic product of Russia in general. And that was the moment when a lot of people actually turned their eyes to discovering the pre-war past. Already in the Perestroika period or the Brezhnev period of stagnation, so Brezhnevsky Zastoy, a lot of people started digging, sometimes figuratively, sometimes they actually did dig in the ground to uncover some traces of pre-war past, because they were interested, because it provided them a refuge or an escape from the otherwise very difficult economic and social situations. Olga Sezneva, a Russian researcher now based in the US, I believe, she refers to those people as the diggers. And they would uncover different things, pieces of crockery with swastika on it, bottles from before the war, some other elements, bric-a-brac from the pre-war times. And that definitely fueled that fascination that became even bigger throughout the 90s. Very much so because of the lack of alternative. There was also the period where first cross-border contacts were established on a larger scale, other than just ceremonial visits or ceremonial meetings on the border. Some of my interviewees actually told me that throughout the 70s and the 80s, there was no real cross-border cooperation between communist Poland and Kaliningrad Oblast of the Soviet Union. But what happened was that functionaries from both sides of the border would actually go to the border, they would put a table on the border, literally on the border, and some of them would sit at the Polish side, would sit on the Polish side, the Soviet side would sit on the Soviet side. So basically they were not crossing the border, but they could still talk. And even though this talk, these discussions didn't really mean much, one could say that the cooperation was there. But 1991 definitely marks that moment when real cross-border cooperation is possible. And it was there, even though to a modest extent. Kaliningrad also became that area because of some economic solutions provided to alleviate those negative consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which profited from corruption, from smuggling a lot of goods into the rest of Russia from the West, from Poland and from other Western countries. But things started to change, and they've gained a bit more of an organized look in 2000s. That's the moment when, on one hand, Vladimir Putin comes to power. On the other hand, the economic situation in Russia improves because of the rising oil prices. So the legacy of the bad 90s is somehow overcome. There is this period of relative stabilization. And Kaliningrad also benefits from it to the extent that, again, the economic growth in Kaliningrad was higher than the rest of Russia on average. And this is where that moment of maybe not economic prosperity, but some sort of economic progress became very much aligned with discovering the pre-war past and trying to put it to a good use or to a profitable use. And you see two examples of this phenomenon. One is a very prominent transport company from Kaliningrad called Kionik after. Everything was named after Kionik, so the Russian name of Königsberg. Königsberg was present everywhere. To an extent that the Soviet BE Zhigulyovskaya was actually rebranded into Königsberg at some point, which also became a point of criticism in mid 2010s. But I'll come to that in a second. There was a moment when those elements of pre-war past became a source of regional pride. It did not bear any political meaning, though. It was only a way of trying to associate more with that pre-war legacy, understanding that Kaliningrad Oblast now belongs to Russia, but it also has a non-Russian pre-war history. It did not really translate into any separatist political agenda as many would have liked to see it. It was just a layer of identity, a regional layer or layer of regional identity, which came not necessarily on top of the national identity, because even some studies from that period indicate that most people living in Kaliningrad Oblast consider themselves to be citizens of Russian Federation. Most of them will also be ethnic Russians. I think that this distinction between Ruski, so ethnic Russian, and Rossiyski, so belonging to the political Russian nation, is important to be made in this context. But they definitely felt that at the same time they were Russians and they were Kaliningraders, or people living in Kaliningrad Oblast. So these two layers of identity were not mutually exclusive. And that's something that I think is important to understand what happened in 2010s. We have a slide, just to come back to what I begin with. We have a slight inclination of some people to reuse the myths that were created before 1945. Some of them were somehow strengthened by the so-called sentimental tourism. So after 1991, where traveling to Kaliningrad Oblast was made possible, a considerable number of Germans who either were born in East Prussia or today's Kaliningrad Oblast, or their families came from there and they needed to flee, or they were resettled to what is today's Germany. They started coming to Kaliningrad Oblast to discover their family roots. It was also envisaged in a number of books that were written, not only memoirs but also fiction about that phenomenon, about that area, and it also fueled that interest, the local interest, the regional interest of the pre-war history of Kaliningrad Oblast, also because money could be made on those tours and those tourists coming to the region. But it also fueled the discussion about the pre-war times and their importance to contemporary Kaliningraders. So that myth created already after the war, one could say, about paradise lost or the land of childhood was somehow resonating, especially in the 2000s and early 2010s in Kaliningrad Oblast. Another thing that somehow fueled the discussion is the 2004 EU enlargement. 10 countries joined, but from the point of view of this presentation in my book, what matters is that we're talking about Poland and Lithuania, so two countries that border Kaliningrad Oblast, and that had different consequences. One of them was that in 2003, both countries introduced visas for Kaliningrad Oblast inhabitants. That was the requirement for them to join the EU and later on to join the Schengen zone, which happened in December 2007. So that also somehow contributed to the increase of that feeling of seclusion, of being separated from mainland Russia, but also from Kaliningrad Oblast's immediate surroundings. This was only partly overcome by the so-called facilitated travel document. So people from Kaliningrad Oblast could actually travel to mainland Russia in trains without visas, only having the FTD. And then in 2011, 2012, when the local border traffic agreement was signed between the EU, the European Commission, and Russia, but only pertained to Poland, not to Lithuania. And I think that this is an interesting case of how the pre-war legacy was used to pursue political goals at the federal level in Russia. So the 2005 Königsberg celebrations, Vladimir Putin came to Kaliningrad Oblast. He did not come to Kaliningrad. Actually, all the celebrations were taking part in Svetlogorsk on the Baltic Sea coast. But he invited two European leaders. He invited the Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schröder, and then Jacques Chirac, the President of France, to talk about what it means, what it meant for Russia to have the piece of land, and to also discuss some other policy areas. Interestingly enough, this meeting was not attended by the presidents or prime ministers of Lithuania and Poland because they were not invited. Even though from the cultural point of view, and again, the historical importance of Kaliningrad, Königsberg, it was way more important for today's Poland and Lithuania than to France, and maybe that's debatable to Germany. So that was definitely a very interesting political use, or an example of political use of this area. Also because that was again 2005, that the enlargement of both the EU and NATO, which happened in the same year in terms of Lithuania, and in terms of Poland in 1999 and then 2004, that was a negative development from the Russian point of view. So probably that was the reason why these two leaders were not invited. Another interesting case, I guess, when it comes to the formation of collective memory, and one of the last positive elements in the recent history is local border traffic. It was signed between Poland and Kaliningrad Oblast of Russia, and it encompassed, spanned across the whole of Kaliningrad Oblast and a very sizable territory on the Polish side. So it went beyond the usual 30-kilometer radius that was set by the European Union, and because of that, it encompassed sizable cities such as Olsztyn, but also the Three Cities, so Gdańsk, Gdynia, and Sopot, and Elbląg. And because of that, Russians were from Kaliningrad Oblast were able to come to that area without visas, only based on the local border traffic permits. And even though a lot of Russians were coming to actually do their shopping in Poland, to I don't know, use different services such as plastic surgery establishments on the Polish side of the border, and then Poles would come to Russia just to buy cheap cigarettes and maybe fuel. There was also a sizable group of people that started looking at the Polish approach towards the pre-war legacy, which was very much different because it wasn't that controversial. Again, we're talking about the 500th anniversary of the Prussian homage. Prussia, as a political entity, but also as a cultural phenomenon, has been present in the Polish collective awareness or collective memory, and the Prussian legacy was never considered to be something foreign, maybe with the exception of the political legacy. But when it comes to the cultural legacy, when it comes to other soft elements, I would say it was not the case. So definitely local border traffic was a positive example. And I feel that the discussion that was taking place at that time in Kaliningrad was also somehow influenced by the local border traffic. There was this idea to reconstruct the historical city center of Kaliningrad, to either rebuild it or to do something with those vast empty spaces, both on the Knajpchov island or along the banks of the Pregel or Pregolia river. Some of them included the reconstruction of the royal castle, some of them some other elements, maybe redoing the House of Soviets, and you can see them in the bottom. In reality, that was a discussion that fueled a lot of talks about the positive legacy of the pre-war times, and also highlighted the negative legacy of the Soviet times, with all this negligence presence on the street, with the low quality of buildings, with lack of urban planning and that collective thinking about public spaces. So in a way it was positive, in a way it was also very bitter. And that's also the period that marks the change in the attitude, a gradual change in the attitude of federal authorities towards Kaliningrad Oblast and its collective memory, and how Moscow would like to shape it. In 2012, Vladimir Putin comes back to the presidential seat. That's his third term as the president after the brief interlude of Dmitry Medvedev. And what he does during the presidential campaign is that he publishes a series of articles about different policy areas. Some of them are related to memory, legacy, Russia as a nation, Russia as a civilizational center in the Huntingtonian terms. That's also something that Krzysztof Rzęgota writes about in his book from the constructivist point of view. So Vladimir Putin views Russia as a civilizational center. And because of that, things started to change in Kaliningrad as well, which coincided with the beginning of the local scale war in Ukraine. We're also talking about the annexation of Crimea, and that's the moment when the federal center, together with the president's plenipotentiary in St. Petersburg, start looking at the situation in Kaliningrad Oblast again when it comes to memory and other elements, and also start to actively get engaged in it. There's a picture I took during my research trips to Kaliningrad. This is actually outside of Kaliningrad, but something that definitely I think that illustrates those feelings or the sentiments of those who followed that central or federal narrative really well. What was being brought up somehow underlined by the federal leadership, the federal authorities, was the presence of Russian troops, Russian army across the centuries in the area. And it was started from the 7 Years' War, so mid-18th century, when Russia occupied East Prussia for 4 years, where Kant actually also swore allegiance to the Empress Elizabeth. And this is why some Russians would say, well, that means that he was one of us, he was Russian, and some would say, no, he was a traitor because he betrayed his own country. So I think that this tension is definitely envisaged there. The second conflict was the Napoleonic Wars, where again Russian troops were there. Then there's the First World War, where the Russian troops invaded East Prussia, and then they were repelled only afterwards. And then the Second World War as a proof of historical justice, and the fact that this area was freed from Nazism, and then it was also taken over by the Soviet Union and later on Russia. This was also present in the sort of splinter discussion about the future of the historical city center. What you see on this image is the so-called October Island. So that area that before the war was very, very much abandoned, there were no many buildings over there, because these were very, very swampy meadows, and this is how the area was called, Stadtwiese, so city meadows. And the Russian authorities decided to build a football stadium over there, which was a very bold move, because it really, again, went back to the idea how to stabilize the ground when you want to build such a big object. But it was built, but it was not the end. It was just the beginning of creating a cluster of Russian cultural institutions. Vladimir Putin announced that major Russian museums, ballet schools, theaters will all establish their branches in Kaliningrad, exactly in this territory, to strengthen the officially understood Russianness of the region, so that no one would have any doubts about what this region is, what it has been, and what it used to be. And that's something that I feel, again, is very much related to geopolitics, to the growing tensions between Russia and the West, but also that idea of refining the officially understood Russianness, this federal narrative on the Russianness understood as a national identity, but also as a civilizational entity. And Kaliningrad Oblast plays a role, a very prominent role in this process, which I feel is very much depicted in a documentary that was released shortly before the outbreak of the pandemic, late 2019, Russian Prussia, or Ruskaya Prussia. And this documentary, even though it was advertised as a proof of 1,000-year-long connections between Prussia and Russia, it was very much focused on the four military conflicts that I just mentioned. So the 7-Year War, Napoleonic Wars, First World War, and the Second World War. And then it was also very much a strong message about the contemporary times, telling that if Russian soldiers enter this area and if they conquer it, that means that it remains Russian forever. A very strong message, which was again very much related to geopolitics. And this is just a post with a very strong post, because my book actually finishes around the 2018-2019 time marker. But I feel that all these things resonate these days, and I just wanted to briefly touch about them. This is a picture taken in the Ukrainian city of Kherson. It was very, very briefly occupied by the Russian forces as an aftermath of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But you see that the governor of Kaliningrad Oblast, Anton Alihanov, he is now the federal minister of industry. But you might ask, what's going on? Why is a governor of very remote area in Russia present in Russia-occupied Kherson? Well, that's because Russians introduced the area, or the idea of partner regions. So Kaliningrad was supposed to curate the situation on the ground in Kherson, somehow provide logistical help, technical help, and this is why Alihanov went to Kherson, which again to me is a way of reusing something that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians used during the First World War, so the so-called Patenschaft. So those areas of East Prussia that were affected by the Russian offensive, and they were somehow destroyed. For instance, the city of Ełk in today's Poland was very much destroyed. They were all being taken care of by bigger cities spread all around Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they were supposed to take care of these areas, provide financial support, provide logistical support, also help those people who became homeless as a result of the Russian offensive. And this is exactly the same kind of logic that's being perpetuated more than 100 years ago. So another example of reusing the myths created during the existence of East Prussia in the contemporary tense geopolitical conflict. And the last thing, that's 2023, so well into the war in Ukraine. This is a monument of Muravyov, who was a Russian general, infamous for crushing the January uprising in today's Poland and Lithuania and Belarus. And he was again infamous for hanging a lot of the insurgents in the Vilnius area. This is why he earned his nickname Wieszatel, so the hangman. And his monument was actually in Vilnius up until 1915, when the retreating Russian troops left Vilnius, and then the advancing German troops came to Vilnius, and it was only then that it was torn down. And this is an exact copy of that monument, which was erected in Kaliningrad, right in front of Lithuania's consulate general. So again, we're talking about this very strong competition of memories, maybe even confrontation of memories, as I put it in my book. And I feel that the collective memory of Kaliningrad Oblast has come a long way from the phenomenon that was very much bottom-up, grassroots-like, into something that was taken over by the Russian authorities, and it was put to use or to pursue very clearly defined political goals which go beyond Kaliningrad Oblast, which also encompass the rest of Russia and that bigger imperialist, chauvinist narrative that the Russian authorities have been pursuing for at least 11 years, I would argue. Thank you for listening to the slightly long presentation. I hope it will provide a good basis for discussion. Like I said, if you want a copy of this presentation, or you want to learn more about my book, these are my email addresses. This is also a photo that I took during my diplomatic service in Kaliningrad, which somehow exemplifies what's going on in today's Russia, today's Kaliningrad Oblast. It's all about military, it's all about Eastern Orthodoxy and other cultural and political elements of the officially understood Russianness. Thank you.
Thank you, Miłosz, for the presentation. It is a great basis for a discussion indeed. But before we move on to a discussion and questions from our participants, I would like to ask Professor Żongota, for his comments. I saw Professor was nodding during the presentation a couple of times, so I'm sure he has some remarks to what you just presented to us. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to thank you and to reflect my gratitude for invitation here. It's great to be here with you, and great to discuss such an important and significant and interesting publication. First of all, I would like to emphasize that Miłosz Cordes is still, I would say, young but very experienced researcher. He also was a member of Polish diplomatic staff, so he has practical experience in shaping relations with Kaliningrad region, with Russian Federation, and this combining scientific and practical experience is significant in my opinion. I'd like to just share with you just few remarks and comments related to book and related to your presentation. First impression is that book is quite big. It's more than 200 pages. Another impression and remark concerns this great insight into Prussian history of this area of contemporary Kaliningrad region, and to be honest, I was impressed by this reflection on historical conditions of development of historical awareness and identity of residents contemporary Kaliningrad region, but in my opinion there are some similarities between these processes of shaping regional identity between contemporary Kaliningrad region and East Prussia before Second World War, as well before First World War, because as Miłosz mentioned before, and I would confirm it, and I fully agree with this remark that both Kaliningrad region and East Prussia before Second World War, as well as before First World War, were peripheral areas from perspective of now Moscow and then Berlin, and it was another condition of shaping very specific regional identity in East Prussia before Second and before First World War, and in current situation in Kaliningrad region. Of course, also very interesting element of this book, this work, is shaping of regional identity after Second World War, because it was mentioned during your presentation, Miłosz, that German Empire tried to build its own mythology it was built in East Prussia. To some extent, Soviet Union also tried to build its mythology in Kaliningrad region after the Second World War, because in my opinion they tried to build real Soviet area without churches, without faith, and with Soviet ideology. So it is another similarity between Kaliningrad region and East Prussia. Of course, the most significant and interesting from perspective of my research is this part of book which presents this crossroads situation in contemporary Kaliningrad region, because in my research I tried to develop this element of location, very specific location of Kaliningrad region, which is on the one hand part of Russian Federation, and for sure it is element of Russian policy aimed at reunification of post-Soviet space. In my opinion, the Russian aggression against Ukraine is part of this project of reunification of post-Soviet space, and for sure Kaliningrad region as part of Russia is part of this also processes. On the other hand, Kaliningrad region maintained relatively intensive relations with cross-border relations with partners and different entities from Poland, from Lithuania, from Germany, even from maybe Sweden, I suppose. So this region had relatively independent foreign relations with foreign partners. It wasn't normal. It wasn't obvious situation in Russian Federation. This is why this title of this chapter is absolutely significant for me. Of course, Miłosz Cordes commented in this chapter very specific attitude to heritage, German heritage in Kaliningrad region. In contemporary Kaliningrad, he commented these projects of rebuilding of heart of city, as well as he presented very specific situation on Polish-Russian border, particularly during this time of functioning of local border traffic, which was important period of time even for Vermont-Mazur region, for Olsztyn. Now I'm living in Olsztyn. I'm here, and I hear very often Russian language on streets of Olsztyn, but now it's just language of refugees, war refugees from eastern Ukraine. But during functioning of local border traffic, I heard also very often Russian language on streets of Oblast, but it was just tourists from Kaliningrad region and people who went here for shopping, and it was for sure significant element of contacts, normal everyday contacts between Poles and Russians. I would like to also point out some things, some remarks. I would like to even ask Miłosz what is his forecast concerning identity or changes of identity of residents of Kaliningrad region after February 2022. Because on one hand, Russian authorities try to strengthen patriotic approach to this war, situation, but on the other hand, I'm sure that residents of Kaliningrad region are aware of all this propaganda machine, which is and propaganda which is presented in Russian state media, and they don't straightly believe in this propaganda. In my opinion. So I hope that my question will be some beginning of discussion and talks about your book, about your publication. I'd like to emphasize once again that I'm very impressed by your work, which you did. And I think that it's great time to give the floor to audience, to other participants of this event. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Professor. Miłosz, maybe you would like to start with the answering of the first question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Krzysztof, for all the warm words. I'm so very happy that we can have this discussion together again, given your vast experience in Kaliningrad Oblast related affairs. I mean, obviously, your question is very relevant in the sense that I think that the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has provided a logical consequence to all those actions that we had already seen in Kaliningrad, but at the same time, it has brought it onto a different level. And it's difficult to talk about this without relevant quantitative data, but obviously this data is really not very easily accessible in the current Russian context. But what I can say is that I was doing some digging for the DEES report, so the report that I published last year for the Danish Institute of International Studies, from a slightly more security related side of things. And I came across on some data that indicate that the vast majority of people in Kaliningrad Oblast now identify themselves as Russians when they talk about their ethnicity. So they talk about themselves as Ruski. Now, ever since the end of the war and the beginning of the coming of new settlers, Soviet settlers to Kaliningrad Oblast, the situation looked slightly different. Russians would constitute anything between 80 and 85% of people living in Kaliningrad Oblast. Then another 10 to 12% that would be Belarusians and Ukrainians. And that had very much reflected the fact that the settlers came from the Russian Federative Socialist Republic, and then the Ukrainian and the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republics. But now, almost all of them identify themselves as Russians. Which again, I don't really think that they changed their ethnicity so quickly, or they left. I think this indicates the fear you can't really identify yourself as an Ukrainian given everything that's been going on towards Ukraine or vis-a-vis Ukraine. On one hand, on the other hand, it's just better to keep your head very, very low because you never know how things gonna evolve for you. I mean, if you can go to a public space and you can say no to war in Ukraine, and then you can get 7 years in prison. This is where the Russian phenomenon, this cultural, social phenomenon of nienachodzimość kicks in, right? So the ability of retaining social posture that will be very much in line with what the authorities expect of you or what you think the authorities expect of you, and then bury everything else that you think very, very deep inside. And this also pertains to identity of the Kaliningrad Oblast inhabitants. I really feel that these days, talking about the distinctive regional identity of people living in Kaliningrad Oblast is not necessarily something that they want to do themselves, because of the tension, of the political tensions, because of this growing authoritarian tendencies in Russia. So, so my understanding would be that the whole idea of regional identity that would not be in any way competitive to the national Russian identity, but it would be more of something that maybe complements it, is something that needs to be put on hold in the eyes of the inhabitants of Kaliningrad Oblast themselves.
Okay, now it's the moment when we can all start asking questions. For the moment, I don't see any raised hands yet, so maybe I'll start with my question. Miłosz, your book covers the first 25 years of post-Soviet period, but as you are showing, the findings have a meaning, have implications for today. You did your research in Poland, but also in Kaliningrad. You are already talking about constraints, about the limitations, the current political situation. My question is to you, if you wanted to carry this research on from the 25 years on, yes, how would you do it in the current situation? You probably cannot travel to Kaliningrad. What obstacles do today's researchers face researching Kaliningrad, Russia in general, and how they overcome this? Because we all know that right now our empirical knowledge about Russia is unfortunately very limited. But what is your approach to that? How would you see how we could overcome this to have better knowledge?
So when I started coming to Kaliningrad Oblast for academic reasons, I could definitely still rely on relatively accessible data, but also the bulk of my research is related to semi-structured interviews that I carried out, approximately 50 of them, and I could still talk to people. That was the time when there was still a bit of openness. 2015, that's also the moment when the Russians were allowed to come to the Polish side of the border based on the local border traffic agreement. It was only suspended by the Polish government in July 2016. So I could also talk to Russians, not only in Kaliningrad, but also in Poland during their trips to the Polish side of the border. I also feel that there was that the political tensions, even though they were already there because it was after the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, it felt everything that was going on in Kaliningrad was just rather distant. And that's not something that's the case today. Kaliningrad is, like I try to prove in this discussion, is very much entangled in everything that's been going on. One thing is the participation of Kaliningrad Oblast regional authorities in what's going on in Ukraine and the Russia-occupied parts of Ukraine, but also, for instance, the fact that in 2022, when the new school subject in Russian public education system was launched, that talks about the important, разговоры о важном. It was launched in Kaliningrad by Putin himself. So the atmosphere in Kaliningrad and in the region is very much unfavorable from the point of view of going there and carrying out research. I'm not even talking about the limitations that any Western researcher might have just by coming to Kaliningrad and possibly, I don't know, getting detained, getting arrested under whatever pretext. Already when I was doing my research, I felt that there was a growing, as time went, that there was a growing necessity for me to rely on online sources. And I'm not only talking about different media outlets, but also about social media and the comments that people were giving, you know, and that was a very meticulous thing because you needed to verify the identity, you really needed to look at the context, you really needed to be careful, you needed to tread very carefully on that rather shaky ground of using online materials, but that was the necessity. And I feel that these days, this would be something that one would have to employ more, and I feel that this would have to be complemented by reading between the lines way more, because otherwise it's almost impossible to obtain any sort of data. I mean, all opinion polls or sociological surveys, they very much limited to the very inner circle of Russian authorities. They're not being published. Only some insignificant elements of these opinion polls are being published. It's just something that one really needs to take into account, but I think it makes it all the more important to continue researching places like Kaliningrad Oblast. Because from the point of view of not only us academics, but also from the point of view of understanding today's Russia and maybe trying to respond to the situation in Russia and trying to maybe sort of involve in a positive dialogue with the Russian society, it's very important to understand what's going on. But there are some serious limitations to how to obtain data, what kind of data one can obtain. I can tell you that one of the most prominent Kaliningrad-based historians, Yuri Kostyashov, he's very much known for carrying out a number of interviews with those who came to East Prussia in 1945, and they stayed there, and he was doing it together with his students in the 80s, late 80s and then early 90s. That was a very specific type of research that he was able to do only because of perestroika and only because of that overall hullabaloo that the Soviet Union was experiencing. Even in the 90s, it was very difficult to repeat it, and especially in the 2000s or 2010s, it was unimaginable to do something similar. So I feel that even though there is some material that one can use as a background, as a backdrop, it's aging, and it is very challenging to obtain something a bit more up to date.
If I may ask the same question to Krzysztof, I can imagine maybe that your work changed after 2022, also in terms of the access to empirical data, but maybe not. But how do you overcome, how do you deal, how do you research this topic today?
Definitely, this situation after February 2022 has changed my conditions of my work and access to data. As you know, practically border is closed. Theoretically, we can cross the border and even apply for Russian visa and receive this visa, touristic visa, and cross the border and enter Kaliningrad region. But to be honest, I don't think it's secure and safe to travel to Kaliningrad region and Russia now. Of course, due to situation in Ukraine, due to Russian aggression against Ukraine, we had to just to stop all contacts with Russian scientific sphere, officially and even unofficial contacts. Of course, my university just finished cooperation with Immanuel Kant Baltic Federal University. University. Before war, before February 2022, this cooperation was quite intensive. We carried out some research projects. We implemented some projects of students exchange, as well as also staff exchange between our universities. Now all this cooperation is just finished. We cannot do this. Of course, I have some unofficial contacts with my friends from Kaliningrad. Some of them still have some access to, let's say, Western social media, like Facebook, for instance. This is why I have this contact, but it is just unofficial relations with them. Of course, we as researchers try to still conduct our research on the basis of these sources which we still have access to it. It is just Russian state media. Of course, we are aware that it is just state propaganda, but on the basis of this propaganda or some informations which are presented in first or even second part of this narratives, we can read something and get some information, not straight maybe information, but some information what is going on in the region. Of course, important source are local, regional and local media, which are maybe not fully independent, but to some extent they present independent information. And my experience and my this information which I got from local media was even confirmed by other researchers from Poland, because we conducted and they conducted some research on comparison between narratives presented in Kaliningrad regional media with regard to Russian aggression against Ukraine, and they compared it to regional media in other parts of Russian Federation. And the conclusion was that in other parts of Russia they present more patriotic approach. They try to present Russian aggression against Ukraine as just another great patriotic war. But in Kaliningrad regional media, this approach wasn't as patriotic as it was in other medias. These narratives were more pragmatic, let's say. And of course, we still look for and we still are in touch with Russian scientific journals, and to some extent we also can get some information from these scientific articles and publications which are released in Russia. But for sure, from my perspective, the most significant element of my research when I conducted it very intensively were just trips to Kaliningrad, and when I was able to visit Kaliningrad, to visit university, to meet researchers from Kaliningrad. Now it is impossible. Another obstacle is that some part of my scientific experience was research on Polish minority in Kaliningrad region, and their current situation is very, very specific because, as Miłosz mentioned before, some members of Ukrainian or Belarusian minority are supposed to present their Russian patriotism, let's say, and Russian identity. And I observe similar processes with regard to some part of Polish minority as well in Kaliningrad region. Of course, some of them they were forced to come to Poland, for instance, due to this very specific policy of Vladimir Putin. So it is another obstacle for me as researcher. For sure, the situation is very weird and very strange. We still hope that war will will be finished by politicians, and maybe there will be an opportunity to rebuild our relations with, I hope, democratic Russia in future. I hope that I'm not naive talking such and presenting such hopes.
Wow. Yes, I am almost lost for a comment now, but yes, I think yes. Miłosz, what do you see this as implications for this limited knowledge that we have? Can we build good policies? Can we build ground for the future if we're so limited in our knowledge about the situation in Russia now? And you were a diplomat, so you know how important it is to have this knowledge.
Well, yeah, I definitely think it was a very big privilege for me to be able to spend 3 years in Kaliningrad Oblast as a diplomat, because on one hand I had the possibility to interact with the Russian society, to observe it in its many ways, and to talk to people while not being part of the society, and also having this rather big safety net provided by the fact that I was a foreign diplomat. So even in case something had happened, the only thing that would have happened to me would have been to have been kicked out of the country. But I just which would have happened anyway, right? Because I left half a year before the beginning of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I guess that my fate would have been sealed anyway. But what I feel is that now, more than ever in Kaliningrad Oblast post-Soviet history, we're talking about a region that's completely deprived of any sort of agency. It's a region that's completely dependent on Moscow in different ways. One is that the financing scheme of Russian regions is increasingly centralized. So Kaliningrad relies on federal support, financial support. There is not that much industry or heavy industry in the area. Practically there's none. And this is also why if you look at some still accessible statistical data, you will notice that even though Russians in general are bragging about the industrial production increasing, but that's because of the war, because of the military production increasing. If you look at the regions that are deprived of heavy or military industry, you will see that their industrial production is declining, and Kaliningrad Oblast is definitely one of them. So that in this case, Kaliningrad Oblast gives you an indication what's going on in the whole of Russia and what kind of quality that economic growth is of. So, and I feel that in this case, Kaliningrad can still be a gateway for us to understand Russia more precisely, because not what it is, but what it isn't. And maybe another thing that I feel is that because of the fact that Kaliningrad is just another region of Russia these days, even though it's so close and has a different history and it's separated from mainland Russia, you only have maritime connection or aerial connection. It is an area that will not experience any significant changes without changes at the federal level. So in this case, any changes that at some point might occur in any direction at the federal level. It's only then when they can resonate in Kaliningrad. So I also feel that our influence, even though we might collect a lot of information, even though we might increase our capacities as researchers of Kaliningrad Oblast as such, and Kaliningrad Oblast as part of the Russian Federation, that our influence is greatly limited just by definition. There were some attempts to mark the foreign presence in the region with some development cooperation. The Swedish Developmental Agency was there also because they wanted to increase the quality of the water quality of the Pregel River. Because of the Baltic currents, actually most of the Pregel River travels all the way to the Swedish island of Gotland. So because of that, the Swedes were also involved in those water processing plants in the area. There was the example of the local border traffic cooperation, but all of this is not significant in any way without systemic changes in Russia as a whole. And I'm not sure if anyone can be optimistic right now, because one thing is the policies pursued by the Russian authorities, but the other thing is also the behavior of the Russian society. And we feel we're talking about a significant lack of courage and a significant lack of ability to protest in different areas, and especially in today's context. I don't really think that anybody in Russia is seriously considering it on a mass scale. And because of that, I feel that it's just extremely difficult to look at Kaliningrad without making these very strong and very direct connections to the rest of Russia. Because I feel that Kaliningrad Oblast today in 2025 is more Russian, and I'm not talking about only ethnic or cultural terms, but also talking about political terms, and from the point of view of the incumbent Russian leadership, is more Russian than it has ever been. And I'm even ready to extend it onto the Soviet times, because in the Soviet times, this area, no one really knew what to do with it. It was needed for its military reasons, but when it comes to rebuilding the region, the first kind of holistic program to rebuild or to construct the Soviet Kaliningrad Oblast was only brought to life in 1948. So 3 years after the end of the war, the last German inhabitants, pre-war inhabitants of this area, left in the early 50s, and then up until early 80s, there was nothing going on with that huge hole in the historic city center left after the destruction of the castle. So I feel that the relationship between Kaliningrad Oblast and the federal center, be it Soviet Moscow or Russian Moscow, is that of negligence, that of oblivion, forgetfulness. And that's also something that we have to be dealing with if we want to understand Kaliningrad. And I feel that the key to understanding Kaliningrad lies more and more in Moscow, maybe to an extent in St. Petersburg, that it lies in Kaliningrad itself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. No, I understand your train of thought, and I agree. I mean, from this perspective, it is just another region in Russia for us. I think in Poland, and I see colleagues from Lithuania or specialists in Lithuania, it just happens to be the region that's the closest to us, and the one that we actually fear the most. So maybe I will invite our colleagues who specialize in Lithuania or are from Lithuania to join the discussion. But I would like to ask Krzysztof, because we talked before this meeting that in Poland, the reports about Kaliningrad, the media coverage is pretty much limited to the security reasons and the bombs and yes, security reasons. Is it rightly so? How serious is the threat that is presented to us by mainstream media? Yeah, if you could, based on your research, elaborate to us, how do you see the situation currently?
For sure, as I mentioned before, Kaliningrad region is part of Russian Federation, is part of Russian policy with regard to Ukraine, with regard to Central and Eastern Europe, including Poland and Lithuania. It is just one element of this big Russian political military machine, let's say, and engine, we would say. So for this perspective, geographical location of Kaliningrad region is still in the current situation source of threats for both Poland and Lithuania, particularly for my region, for Varmia and Mazur region. So for sure, we look very carefully on Kaliningrad region and we very intensively observe military situation in the region. Of course, for us as residents of border region, strengthening of Polish presence in borderlands. I think about all these projects of militarization of our region, including Shield East project, such as Hood project, are factors of security of our region. So it's important element for Varmia and Mazur Voivodeship, particularly from let's say touristic potential of our region. How to encourage tourists from Poland for other parts of Poland or from even Europe, encourage them to visit Varmia and Mazur region. And when tourists look at map and realize that it's so close to Kaliningrad region, it's very complicated. Seemingly war situation in Ukraine and Russian invasion against Ukraine is a significant condition of our regional security. But on the other hand, we have to be aware that most of the military troops permanently deployed in Kaliningrad region were engaged in Russian aggression and Russian invasion against Ukraine. So according to different assessments, number of soldiers deployed in the Kaliningrad region before war, it was about 25 or 30,000 soldiers, but after starting war, many of them were engaged in Russian aggression against Ukraine. So now, according to different estimations and assessments, the number of soldiers located in Kaliningrad region is less than 10,000 soldiers. So this is maybe strange situation and paradox, but we are more secure due to Russian aggression against Ukraine. Of course, I'm not a military expert. I'm not a soldier, but according to my talks with soldiers, with officers of Polish army, in case of any straight or hybrid aggression, Russian aggression against Poland or Baltic states, one of aims of actions of Polish army would be Kaliningrad region. So we have an opportunity just to eliminate Kaliningrad region in war situation from this war theater in case of aggression against particularly Baltic states. So from this perspective, I would say that for sure Kaliningrad region shapes security situation in the Baltic Sea basin and is factor of security of northern part of Poland, is factor of security of Baltic states, particularly Lithuania and this very famous Suwałki Gap. But on the other hand, we don't have to just to show this region as absolutely source of threats, because as I mentioned before, Russian aggression against Ukraine has changed significantly situation and military potential of region. Of course, after Swedish and Finnish joining NATO, situation in the Baltic Sea basin is also different. I would say better for us as allies of new members of NATO.
Thank you. And Miłosz, you are based in Denmark. What is the Danish perspective of the situation here, and Kaliningrad especially?
Well, it comes now as maybe I'll start from a little anecdote. I was once driving from northern Poland to Warsaw, and I was traveling with a woman who was, I think she was coming back from Riga or from Latvia in general, and when she asked me what I do and where I work, and I told her about Kaliningrad, and then she said, well, Kaliningrad rings a bell. Is it in the Polish Inflante? So that area that today actually lies in southeastern Latvia, so a few hundred kilometers away. And I think that illustrates that even Poles are very often have a very blurry image of what Kaliningrad is, where it lies, or what is going on over there. So try to look at it from the perspective of a country that doesn't even neighbor Russia, that for decades just belonged to a different political camp, and has been among the founding members of NATO, and is oriented in a completely different direction, economy-wise, trade-wise, but also politics-wise. So I think that in Denmark, this understanding of what Kaliningrad is has only started changing after 2022, when a lot of Danes realized, hey, it's not necessarily that far away, that this is the closest one can get from Denmark to Russia or vice versa. I think this also came with Danes rediscovering that for Denmark, the end of the Second World War was not that straightforward, that the whole of Denmark was liberated by the British troops, and everybody was just happy about it, and they lived happily ever after. That liberation also came along the Soviet occupation of Bornholm, so Denmark's easternmost island on the Baltic Sea. This occupation lasted for 11 months until April 1946. And a lot of Danes just started thinking, oh, well, actually, no, I mean, there was a part of our territory, maybe not a big part, maybe not that many people live in Bornholm, but they are Danish citizens. And for them, the war actually only ended in April 1946. A lot of the Soviet troops that were stationed in Bornholm, they actually went to Kaliningrad and they stayed there. It was not only a transit point for them. They just decided to settle down because they had nowhere to come back to, because their city or the village or the families were destroyed or killed. And so decided to stay and start living their lives in the Soviet Kaliningrad, or back then still Königsberg. So I feel that this understanding is somehow there, and this was growing, and I feel that my report that I published last year is a beacon of the slightly changing attitude, but it's still a very much terra incognita, and it doesn't really play a major role in Russian studies in general. So maybe that's something that could change at some point, and I'm also trying in my modest capacity to do it here, since I am in Denmark. I live in Copenhagen, and I work here. There's a number of events that will be actually coming in the coming weeks, also about this book, where I'll be trying to present the situation on the ground in Kaliningrad Oblast and maybe spark some interest in this area. There is definitely momentum. because of what's going on, because of the tensions, because of the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia's full-scale invasion of the country, and Krzysztof mentioned Sweden and NATO, and Sweden and Finland joining NATO. There is definitely a growing interest, and there's also growing understanding that Russia will stay with us. And since no one in Europe, I mean, the EU or NATO really wants any border changes, that's the principle of post-1945 international relations in Europe, like no territorial changes, unless the populations involved want it. There's growing understanding that Kaliningrad Oblast will stay with us. And I think it's really well envisaged by the reading of the vehicle license plate in the Braniewo County, which starts with NBR. And some people actually translated that, interpreted as niebezpiecznie blisko Rosji, so dangerously close to Russia. And I feel that it has gained a completely new dimension since 2022. And sadly, we all have to deal with it, and Denmark is no exception to that. So also because of the growing tensions on the Baltic Sea, in the Baltic Sea region, with all those seabed cables being cut, the dumped munitions in the Bornholm Deep, that's a ticking bomb, ecological bomb, environmental bomb, and the shadow fleet of Russian tankers and other ships. That's something that Kaliningrad Oblast also plays a role in. There is an institution in St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad called GUGI, so the main directorate of sea or deep sea explorations. This, even though it's supposed to be a research institution, is under the Ministry of Defense, and it has played a role in all those tensions and ruptures and tumultuous events around the Baltic Sea. So in a way, Kaliningrad is also involved into that. And even though it goes beyond the topic of my book, which is more about collective memory, memory is also an element of security.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why we also need to keep it in mind. So I hope that in this sense, my book also complements that broader understanding of security and what we as members of the EU, NATO, and the Western world, being so close to Kaliningrad, be it Poland, be it Denmark, we all have to face, or we have to be dealing with.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think this is the momentum for such studies and interest, growing interest in, especially in Western Europe or Northern Europe. And I'm glad your book is the guide to anybody who is discovering this area or realizes that it's important for their work, because as you said, the topic of memory is number one, related to security, but also it helps us avoid this trap that, unfortunately, and I know I come from media, but it's not mainstream, but it helps us avoid the simplification that, unfortunately, media articles often offer, or headlines that are supposed to be catchy, scary, but extremely superficial and not always guide us in the right direction in terms of understanding. So thank you so much for showing this complexity. I don't know if we have more questions from the audience. I still would like to give our participants a chance to ask you some questions. I hope we did not dominate. That's why there is less activity. But if not, then I highly recommend the book to everybody. Miłosz, maybe you could tell us how we could obtain the book, or if you could just tell us at the end where it will be available.
So since this is an academic publication and was published by Routledge, it might be a bit difficult to find it in regular bookstores. I think that the best bet one can make is to just search for it online. Although again, since it's an academic publication, the price might be a bit steep. But what I can do, if someone is interested, they can always contact me, and I can offer an author discount on the book. So I'm more than welcome to provide you with a code or some special link through which you can obtain it at a slightly decreased price. But I'm also sure that if you have access to some online catalogs via your institution, if you are, for instance, employed at a university, then you should be able to find it either as a hard copy in your physical library or as an ebook again, via some sort of database that your institution is subscribed to. There will also be some promotional, like physical promotional events in the coming weeks. I will be coming to, for instance, to Warsaw. I'll also be in Lublin. I'm also hoping to come to Krakow, blink, blink.
Cool.
And maybe to Olsztyn, another blink, blink. And then probably there will also be some physical copies available over there that I will just bring along.
Fantastic. And your report, the one from 2024, is still available online.
It's online and it's free of charge to maybe sweeten the price of the book a bit up. Then it's available completely for free online. And if someone wants to, I can also bring some copies because I have a few copies left, actually physical copies. So I can give them as a complimentary copy to those who will get my book during those meetings that I just mentioned.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Once again, congratulations on the book. Good luck with the future research to both of you. As we found out here today, it's not so easy. I mean, it was never easy. Research is never easy, but you face additional obstacles. So thank you to both of you for doing that and sharing with us your findings, your knowledge. Because as we discussed and we all know, this is very important to our region, to all of us here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.